On April 2, 1961, the air in Washington, D.C. was heavy with promise and peril. President John F. Kennedy, barely 3 months into his administration, had energized the nation with bold declarations, a new frontier of scientific achievement, economic growth, and global leadership. Yet beneath the glittering optimism lurked shadows of a more ominous challenge, the shadow cast by a tiny island fortress just 90 miles from Florida, where Fidel Castro had seized power and aligned Cuba with the Soviet Union. In that fateful spring, the world stood at a crossroads between the bright dawn of Kennedy's vision and the gathering storm of a geopolitical crisis that could have unleashed Armageddon. To understand the pulses of fear and ambition that coursed through the corridors of power in those early days, one must rewind the tape of history to the end of World War II. Emerging from the ashes of global conflict, two superpowers, once allies against the Axis, now stared each other down across an ideological chasm. The United States, champion of liberal democracy and free enterprise, looked across Europe and Asia at Soviet-controlled territories where planned economies and single-party rule held sway. In turn, Moscow perceived a ring of encirclement, American military bases in Britain, West Germany, South Korea, and points beyond. Each side embarked on an epic arms buildup, stockpiling nuclear warheads and delivery systems with the aim of deterring the other from launching a first strike. This era, later dubbed the Cold War, was characterized not by pitched battles but by proxy wars, intelligence operations, and diplomatic brinksmanship. From Greece to Vietnam, Africa to Latin America, each emerging nation was courted or coerced into the orbit of one superpower or the other. Washington and Moscow jockeyed for influence, using economic aid, covert support of insurgents, and symbolic displays of technological prowess, Sputnik and moonshots, to demonstrate the superiority of their respective models. Yet nowhere was the latent threat more acute than in the Western Hemisphere, where the proximity of potential flashpoints meant that any escalation could have immediate and devastating consequences for the U.S. mainland. Enter Cuba, a Caribbean gem whose strategic value belied its modest size. For decades, Havana's political fortunes had waxed and waned under the influence of local strongmen and American business interests. By 1952, Fulgencio Batista, a former sergeant at arms in Cuba's constitutional army, had seized power in a coup, inaugurating a regime marked by corruption and repression. American corporations profited handsomely from sugar plantations, utilities, and casinos, while wealth filtered upward into the pockets of Batista's cronies. Meanwhile, discontent simmered among the Cuban populace, who chafed under economic inequality and political disenfranchisement. In July 1953, a young lawyer named Fidel Castro launched a daring but ill-fated assault on the Moncada barracks in Santiago de Cuba. Though the uprising failed, Castro's subsequent trial and eloquent defense turned him into a folk hero. Exiled to Mexico in 1955, he met Ernesto Che Guevara and other revolutionaries, forging the 26th of July movement. On December 2, 1956, Castro and 81 followers landed clandestinely on Cuban shores, initiating a guerrilla war from the Sierra Maestra Mountains. Over 2 years, his ragtag band of fighters gradually wore down Batista's forces, winning the hearts and minds of peasants with promises of land reform and independence from U.S. economic domination. By January 1, 1959, Castro's revolution triumphed, Batista fled, and the revolutionary flag flew over Havana. Initially greeted with cautious goodwill in the United States, Castro soon alienated American business interests with his calls for nationalization, when he publicly declared the socialist orientation of his government and welcomed Soviet economic and military assistance. Washington's alarm bells rang loudly. In particular, the nascent Kennedy administration perceived Cuba's pivot to communism as an existential threat, an enemy foothold in America's backyard, capable of hosting Soviet missiles aimed at U.S. cities. The new president faced a tortuous dilemma. On one hand, he had campaigned on vigor and resolve, pledging to stand firm against communism's advance. On the other, He was wary of triggering a direct superpower showdown so soon after assuming office. His advisors debated covert action versus diplomatic outreach, military strikes versus continued containment. Ultimately, the CIA presented a plan inherited from the Eisenhower administration: train and equip 1,400 Cuban exiles to launch an amphibious invasion aimed at toppling Castro's regime. Kennedy reluctantly approved, believing that a swift coup would spark an internal uprising and restore a U.S.-friendly government in Havana. On April 17, 1961, the Bay of Pigs invasion commenced. But much went wrong from the outset. U.S. air support was scaled back for political deniability. The landing site proved isolated, and local intelligence underestimated Castro's popular support. Within 3 days, the invasion force was decisively defeated, and over 1,000 exiles were captured. The world watched in disbelief as Kennedy's promise of strength was met with humiliating failure. The Bay of Pigs fiasco cemented Castro's grip on power, transformed him into a symbol of defiance against imperialism, and drove him and Khrushchev into a closer embrace. For the president and his team, the invasion's failure was not merely an embarrassment, it reshaped the strategic calculus of the Cold War. Unable to destabilize Cuba through overt action, Kennedy now faced the possibility that the Soviets, sensing U.S. weakness, might move to deploy offensive weapons on the island. For Khrushchev, the idea held tremendous appeal. By placing medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba, the USSR could counterbalance U.S. missiles in Europe and Turkey, deter another invasion of Cuba, and enhance Soviet prestige. Yet secret deployment of nuclear weapons so close to American shores risked unforeseen consequences. A single miscalculation could trigger global holocaust. The stakes were thus astronomically high, and both capitals conducted months of clandestine planning. Soviet shipping convoys departed Black Sea ports under the guise of grain shipments, while Cuba's airfields and coastal defenses were discreetly prepared. The operation, codenamed Anadir, required absolute secrecy. An intelligence failure would nullify the strategic surprise. In Washington, U-2 spy flights monitored Soviet shipping but struggled to distinguish innocuous cargo from warheads and launchers. By early October 1962, however, photographic evidence of missile sites under construction became irrefutable. When CIA analyst Richard Helms briefed the president, the gravity of the moment crystallized. Strategic parity was at stake. But more acutely, the vulnerability of U.S. cities to a preemptive strike threatened the very concept of deterrence. Kennedy convened the nation's top advisors, ExComm, and prepared to grapple with the most perilous crisis since the Cuban Revolution began. And so, as October dawned, the world paused. In Havana, youthful Cubans marched in the Plaza de la Revolución, waving red flags. In Moscow, Khrushchev pondered his next move over amber divans in the Kremlin. In Washington, the president paced the Oval Office, weighing options so fraught that they could lead to salvation or annihilation. The stage was set for 13 days that would test the limits of power, prudence, and human survival. The morning of October 16, 1962, broke with an uncharacteristic calm over Washington, a deceptive lull before the storm. President Kennedy rose early, his mind already racing through the grainy black and white reconnaissance photos laid out in the White House Situation Room. Each image, captured by high-altitude U-2 spy planes, showed long, concrete pads nestled in the jungles of eastern Cuba, pads unmistakably designed for medium-range ballistic missiles. He summoned his national security advisor, McGeorge Bundy, and CIA Director John McCone to review the intelligence. Over steaming cups of coffee, they pored over the evidence, the size and shape of the missiles, the length of the launchers, the configuration of support trucks and radar units. Every piece confirmed the worst. The Soviets were deploying nuclear weapons that could strike nearly every American city within minutes. By mid-morning, ExComm, the executive committee of the National Security Council, assembled in a windowless conference room adorned with maps of the Western Hemisphere. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Joint Chiefs Chairman General Maxwell Taylor, and other top advisors took their seats around an oval oak table. A single overhead projector cast the missile site photographs onto a blank screen, while a display of Jupiter missile sites in Turkey and Italy provided sobering contrast. For 3 years, the United States had aimed nuclear warheads at Moscow. Now, the Soviets were returning the favor. McCone opened the discussion by summarizing the intelligence. "We have high confidence these are nuclear-armed MRBMs. Operational readiness is imminent. We estimate that within 72 hours, launch crews could be in place." A hush fell over the room. McNamara did the arithmetic. "That gives us less time to act than it took the Japanese to prepare for Pearl Harbor." The implication was unambiguous. Failure to respond decisively risked ceding strategic initiative to Khrushchev. Rusk outlined 4 options, each written in black marker on a flip chart: a surgical airstrike against the missile sites, a full invasion of Cuba, diplomatic pressure through the United Nations, or a naval blockade to prevent further weapons shipments. General Taylor, his face etched with concern, argued vehemently for airstrikes. "Leave them nothing to hide behind," he urged. "We knock out the launchers, their radars, logistical depots, follow up with an invasion, and Castro falls in days." The former combat general favored decisive, kinetic action. McNamara, ever the numbers man, countered that surgical strikes bore too high a risk of missing some sites, and that an invasion would incur unacceptable American casualties and might not topple Castro quickly enough. What if the Cubans retaliated by activating the warheads already in place? As debate intensified, President Kennedy listened carefully, cutting through the rhetoric with steady questions. What about the reaction in Moscow? How might they respond to a strike that kills Soviet personnel? Could Khrushchev retaliate directly against U.S. bases in Europe or even New York? What does the atomic rocket force say we can do if they do? No advisor offered comforting answers. All recognized that once the first bomb, or the first jet, crossed into Cuban airspace to attack Soviet-emplaced weapons, the door to nuclear war would swing wide. After hours of deliberation, a 5th option emerged: a naval quarantine, a blockade in all but name. This measure, while described as a peaceful action, would stop every ship bound for Cuba suspected of carrying offensive military equipment. Naval planners stressed the importance of precise language. Blockade implied a formal act of war, while quarantine suggested defensive measures to protect the quarantining nation. ExComm's younger advisors, including Arthur Schlesinger and Ted Sorensen, pressed hard for the quarantine, arguing it struck a balance, showing strength and resolve without the immediate bloodshed of airstrikes. Late that afternoon, President Kennedy announced to his brother Bobby and several close aides that he would order a naval quarantine. They turned their attention to crafting the public address, a script that would reveal the Soviet missiles to the American people, justify the quarantine to a skeptical world, and leave open the door for peaceful resolution. Kennedy's draft speech opened with a calm invocation of duty: "My fellow Americans." Within the past week, American reconnaissance flights over Cuba have revealed the presence of offensive nuclear weapons, Russian nuclear missiles, on that imprisoned island. He paused over the phrasing, insisting on plain language, no euphemisms, no equivocation. On the evening of October 22, the president stepped behind the Oval Office desk, the Union flag and the presidential seal framing his back. The camera's red light glowed, and across the nation, tens of millions tuned in. Kennedy's measured voice conveyed both gravity and determination. He announced the quarantine, declared that any offensive weapons arriving in Cuba would be turned back, and warned that any act of war against the United States would be met with full retaliation. He closed with a direct appeal to Khrushchev: "To you, my friend, I say this. We have no wish to impoverish the Cuban people or to conquer Cuba. We seek to protect our hemisphere from the dangerous threat posed by these missile sites." Across the globe, reactions were instantaneous. In Havana, Castro convened a war council, preparing to resist any quarantine ships with shore batteries and Soviet advisors. In Moscow, radio crackled with outrage. Khrushchev denounced the quarantine as piratical aggression, vowing to break it if challenged. In New York, diplomats scrambled for a resolution at the United Nations, while journalists speculated on whether Soviet ships would dare run the blockade. In the days that followed, the U.S. Navy positioned squadrons of destroyers and cruisers in a ring around Cuba. With carrier task forces held in reserve offshore, merchant vessels bound for Havana slowed or turned back at the quarantine line 50 miles from the coast. Tension mounted with every passing hour, as U.S. intelligence intercepted coded Soviet messages indicating that supplies, and perhaps additional missile components, were still en route under innocuous guises. ExComm reconvened almost daily, reviewing fresh intelligence, debating modifications to the quarantine's scope, and preparing contingency plans for airstrikes or invasion. Meanwhile, on the diplomatic front, back-channel envoys worked feverishly to avert nuclear war. Robert Kennedy, accompanied by his aide Walt Rostow, met secretly with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin in Bethesda, Maryland. Behind closed doors, they negotiated the terms for missile withdrawal. The United States would pledge not to invade Cuba and would quietly remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey, an agreement too politically sensitive to announce publicly. This quid pro quo formed the kernel of the eventual resolution, though the public narrative would credit the blockade and U.S. resolve alone. In Moscow, news of ExComm's debates filtered through state channels. But Khrushchev faced his own pressures. Hardliners in the Kremlin criticized the Cuban gambit as reckless, while military leaders demanded swift action to counter the quarantine. The Soviet premier dispatched a series of increasingly urgent letters to Kennedy, alternating between conciliatory tone and veiled threats. The first letter offered to remove the missiles if the United States promised not to invade Cuba. The second, arriving at dawn on October 27, took a harder line, demanding that the U.S. withdraw its missiles from Turkey as a precondition. These mixed signals left Kennedy and his advisors scrambling to interpret Soviet intentions accurately. On October 27, a U-2 flight over Cuba was shot down by surface-to-air missiles, killing pilot Rudolf Anderson, though Kennedy's commanders urged immediate retaliatory strikes against air defenses. The president, mindful of the fragile path to peace, refused. He understood that tit-for-tat attacks could trigger a broader exchange. Instead, he publicly downplayed the incident and instructed ExComm to stick to the quarantine plan, while privately pressing his brother and State Department to secure the missile removal deal. Behind the scenes, diplomatic backchannels accelerated. Dobrynin and Robert Kennedy refined the terms. Soviet missiles would depart Cuba under UN supervision. The United States would end the quarantine and pledge not to invade, and the Turkish missiles would be quietly withdrawn within 6 months. With these concessions in hand, Khrushchev agreed to instruct his commanders in Cuba to stand down. On October 28, the world exhaled. A broadcast of the Soviet premier notified the Cuban people that the missiles would be dismantled and returned home. American naval forces began lifting the quarantine, though the public did not learn of the Turkish Jupiter withdrawal until years later. The crisis had been diffused without a single shot fired in anger. Kennedy's blend of firmness and restraint, his ability to weigh military options against diplomatic openings, and his insistence on clear, truthful communication had steered the superpowers away from the abyss. In the immediate aftermath, both capitals moved to consolidate arms control advances. The hotline, a direct teletype link between the White House and the Kremlin, was established in 1963 to prevent miscommunication in future crises. The Limited Test Ban Treaty, signed that same year, halted atmospheric nuclear tests and inaugurated an era of cautious rapprochement known as détente. And though the Cold War would persist for decades, the Cuban Missile Crisis remained the moment when nuclear Armageddon was most nearly realized, and most narrowly averted. By the crisis's end, Kennedy emerged with his reputation restored after Bay of Pigs humiliation. Castro, vindicated by the removal of American missiles from Turkey, had secured his regime and drawn Cuba firmly into the Soviet sphere. Khrushchev, having saved face through secret concessions, returned to Moscow as both victor and cautionary exemplar of brinksmanship's risks. And the people of the world, who had spent nearly 2 weeks under the specter of nuclear devastation, stepped back from the brink with a renewed appreciation for diplomacy's power. As we reflect upon those 13 harrowing days, the lessons remain clear: the necessity of measured resolve, the importance of accurate intelligence, the indispensability of back-channel diplomacy, and the moral imperative of preserving humanity in the face of existential threat. The Cuban Missile Crisis endures not merely as a historical episode, but as an enduring testament to the art of leadership under pressure, and as a warning that the capacity to destroy must never eclipse the will to restrain. On the dawn of October 24, 1962, when the quarantine tightened into place and the world seemed suspended between peace and apocalypse, Soviet cargo vessels laden with missile components steamed toward the Cuban coast. Their manifests cloaked in secrecy. In Washington, U.S. Navy destroyers established a virtual ring around the island. Task Force 135 officers radioed warnings, then boarded and turned back suspect ships. Each interception risked a deadly confrontation, an act of war, yet none dared to fire. And tension gripped every sailor on watch. Behind the blockade, President Kennedy convened ExComm at the White House. Fresh intelligence arrived constantly. U-2 overflights revealed newly completed launch towers. Decrypted Soviet communications hinted at reinforcements still at sea. On a grainy television monitor, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and General Maxwell Taylor huddled over maps plotting naval dispositions, while Secretary of State Dean Rusk warned of the public relations fallout should a Soviet ship challenge the quarantine line by force. In one corner, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy insisted on maintaining flexibility, avoiding irreversible steps like airstrikes, so that diplomacy remained feasible. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Premier Nikita Khrushchev balanced pressures of his own. Hardliners urged him to break the quarantine with force. Moderates warned of nuclear escalation. In private memos, Khrushchev wrote of the psychological impact of missiles so close to American shores. He feared that preemptive strikes by U.S. jets could ignite a full-scale exchange. His first letter to Kennedy, delivered via diplomatic pouch on October 24, proposed removal of Soviet missiles in exchange for U.S. guarantees against invading Cuba. Kennedy's advisors debated how to respond. Some argued for a public airing of the concession. Others, led by Robert Kennedy in secret backchannels, counseled a discreet agreement to avoid appearing to back down. As days passed, the crisis peaked on October 27, the Black Saturday. Two developments almost precipitated disaster. First, a U-2 flight over Cuba was shot down by Soviet-supplied surface-to-air missiles, killing pilot Major Rudolf Anderson. Air Force commanders immediately pressed for retaliatory strikes against missile sites, arguing that failure to respond would embolden the Soviets. President Kennedy, however, paused. He recognized that any attack, even justified, could trigger Soviet nuclear retaliation. He refused to authorize reprisals, instructing his brother Bobby to continue negotiating. Second, a Soviet ballistic submarine lurked beneath the quarantine line near Cuba. Its captain cut off from Moscow due to radio jamming. Low on battery power and out of communication, the sub's officers debated firing a nuclear torpedo at the American destroyers and forcing the quarantine. With 3 officers required to agree, 2 favored launch while the third, politely but firmly, refused. That single act of restraint, at 300 meters depth, prevented a nuclear exchange. The world remained unaware of how close this confrontation had come to exploding into global war. Under these pressures, Khrushchev sent a second, more urgent letter on October 27. He insisted that U.S. Jupiter missiles in Turkey be withdrawn alongside Soviet missiles in Cuba. Publicly, the U.S. could not appear to cave to nuclear blackmail. But privately, Robert Kennedy convinced his brother that a secret deal was possible. The Turks, whose missiles were technically aimed at the Soviet Union, accepted a discrete timetable for removal in exchange for American assurances of defense. On October 28, Kennedy publicly accepted the terms. Soviet missiles would be dismantled under UN supervision, the quarantine would end, Cuba's sovereignty would remain intact, and U.S. forces would refrain from invasion. Soviet ships en route to Cuba turned away. and the crisis ebbed as rapidly as it had flared. In Havana, jubilant crowds cheered Castro's intact regime. In Moscow, Khrushchev was hailed for standing firm. In Washington, Kennedy regained prestige after Bay of Pigs' humiliation, but the world had come perilously close to nuclear annihilation. Reflects on the crisis's legacy. The direct hotline between Washington and Moscow was established to prevent dangerous delays in communication. The Limited Test Ban Treaty of 1963 halted atmospheric nuclear tests, reducing radioactive fallout and building trust for future arms control talks. Later agreements, like SALT and START, built upon the lessons of Cuba. The concept of mutually assured destruction took hold as the defining strategic equilibrium of the Cold War. More profoundly, the Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated that the power to destroy is not the same as genuine security. True strength lay in the willingness to exercise restraint, to negotiate under fire, and to place human survival above ideological triumph. Kennedy's leadership, tempered by advisors urging caution, guided by constant intelligence updates, and underpinned by secret diplomacy, revealed the moral complexity of statesmanship when stakes are existential. For modern audiences, the crisis offers enduring lessons: the necessity of channeling sovereignty through multilateral institutions, the strategic value of backchannels and quiet agreements, and the peril of mixing public posturing with private resolve. In an age of cyber warfare, hypersonic weapons, and shifting alliances, the Cuban precedent warns against reliance on technology alone. It reminds us that judgment, empathy, and strategic foresight remain indispensable as new generations confront emerging flashpoints. October 1962 stands as both a cautionary tale and a beacon of hope, that even at the very edge of Armageddon, diplomacy and restraint can prevail. The crisis abated as suddenly as it had ignited. In the days that followed Cuba's quarantine lift, Soviet missile sites were dismantled under United Nations supervision. American Jupiter missiles quietly removed from Turkey, and both superpowers began to confront the fragile threads that had nearly unraveled global civilization. Yet the world remained irrevocably changed. Those 13 days in October 1962 crystallized harsh truths about the atomic era: that no side could risk first use without courting mutual annihilation, that secret diplomacy must balance public resolve, and that the most dangerous weapons are those no one dares to employ yet none can entirely rule out. Long after the last Soviet transport ships turned back, President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev faced divergent domestic reckonings. In Washington, Kennedy's gamble on a quarantine rather than immediate military strike had restored his standing after the Bay of Pigs debacle. But it also exposed the unprecedented peril he had narrowly averted. He returned to his New Frontier agenda with renewed confidence, sponsoring sweeping domestic reforms even as he maintained a vigil on arms control negotiations. In November 1963, he would urge passage of the Limited Test Ban Treaty, forbidding atmospheric nuclear tests and signaling a tentative thaw in superpower relations. In Moscow, Khrushchev seized upon his perceived strategic victory to consolidate power, weather internal criticism that he had bowed to American intimidation, and tout the USSR's ascendant global posture. Yet he, too, understood that the crisis had starkly revealed the raw horror of nuclear brinksmanship. The Soviet Union signed the Test Ban Accord alongside the United States and Britain, and over the coming years pursued a series of détente initiatives designed to manage Cold War rivalry without risking global thermonuclear war. Beyond treaties and high-level diplomacy, the missile crisis left enduring institutional legacies. The hotline, established in 1963, a secure, direct teletype and later telephone link between the White House and the Kremlin, symbolized both the fragility of peace and the imperative of rapid, reliable communication. Intelligence agencies sharpened their satellite reconnaissance, developing finer-grained imagery and faster analysis capabilities to prevent the dangerous surprises of 1962. Military planners on both sides codified escalation control doctrines, embedding fail-safe procedures and stringent command and control protocols to ensure that any use of nuclear weapons would require explicit, deliberate authorization. But perhaps the deepest legacy lay in the realm of leadership psychology. The Cuban Missile Crisis became a case study in decision-making under existential threat. Taught in war colleges around the world as a testament to the dual virtues of resolve and restraint. Kennedy's measured acceptance of risk, refusing to respond to provocations that would escalate beyond his control, proved in retrospect to be as consequential as his forceful projection of American power. His private courage in resisting calls for immediate retaliation, and his willingness to engage directly with the enemy, embodied a new model of statesmanship where moral clarity and strategic vision went hand in hand. Equally instructive was the episode aboard the Soviet submarine B-59, where Captain Valentin Savitsky's launch code was vetoed by his second-in-command, Vasily Arkhipov. Arkhipov's lone descent averted a nuclear torpedo strike on American destroyers and likely forestalled a chain reaction ending life on Earth. His example underscored that the control of nuclear arsenals demands not just robust command structures but also the individual integrity and judgment of those entrusted with catastrophic power. As the Cold War thawed in the 1970s and 80s, arms control dialogues built upon the Cuban precedent. The Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, INF, and subsequent Strategic Arms Reduction Treaties, START, all traced their lineage to the recognition that unbridled nuclear competition could only end in mutual ruin. Even after the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, the lessons of October 1962 informed non-proliferation efforts. As new nuclear aspirants in South Asia, the Middle East, and East Asia faced the dual imperatives of security and stability. Yet the crisis's shadow persists. In every era of heightened tension, whether over missile defense, space-based weapons, or cyber capabilities, leaders and analysts recall how the Cuban stalemate was resolved not by overwhelming force but by a delicate calibration of pressure and diplomacy. The question, who blinks first, remains central to deterrence theory. But October 1962 illustrates that true victory resides in learning to stand firm without ever pulling the trigger. For contemporary policymakers, the crisis offers cautionary counsel. Today's world may no longer revolve around intercontinental ballistic missiles alone. Hypersonic gliders, autonomous drones, and cyber-electronic threats add new layers of complexity. Yet the core challenge endures: how to manage competition among great powers without sliding into catastrophic conflict. The tools of the modern era, satellites, data analytics, secure communications, are far more sophisticated than U-2 spy planes and sinewy telephone lines. But the human element remains paramount. Empathy, mutual respect, and the courage to consider the adversary's perspective can de-escalate crises before they metastasize. In the end, the Cuban Missile Crisis stands as a testament to the capacity of individuals and nations to learn from near misses. It reminds us that while technology may advance, the fundamental imperatives of leadership, courage, prudence, and moral clarity remain the same. When new flashpoints arise, whether in the Arctic, the South China Sea, or the geopolitical fault lines of cyberspace, the ghosts of 1962 whisper a singular truth: that peace is forged not in the shadow of unchecked power, but in the crucible of tempered resolve and shared humanity. As we reflect on those fateful days, let us carry forward the lesson that the greatest weapon we possess is not the missile silo or the warhead, but the enlightened will to choose dialogue over destruction, and to safeguard our common future against the dehumanizing lure of total war.